definitions and the meaning of words come and go with time. And through generations, we've seen that the meaning of words can change and adapt to mean different and new things, and certain terms will become outdated or mean something completely different in of themselves. We've seen this with certain words in society, in our culture, that we no longer use, or things suddenly have spiked out of nowhere because their meaning has suddenly become very apparent and highly used. But in regards to all that, I kind of want to talk more specifically in terms of the games industry and my experience in using indie game dev versus now the much more, I think, better defined definition, especially for me, as a solo game dev. Because growing up, I watched documentaries like the Indie Game Dev movie, and we saw independent creators. And at the time, it made sense because you basically had these big company studios, AAA, AA, single A even, I think, in a sense. But indie game developers were these people who were doing things opposite to what the crowd was doing. They were usually smaller teams, if not individuals, which has meant, independent. I think independent, when we say indie games, can mean one of two things. Either financially independent or creatively independent. So indie game devs can still, find publishers and find ways of marketing and kind of taking care of themselves financially. But their ideas and stuff are kind of creatively theirs. There isn't some sort of other company or management or person, executive, who's controlling your idea. Then there's also the financially independent, so people, for example, like Notch, Marcus, who made Minecraft, became an indie dev in the sense that he was obviously creatively independent, but also financially. But as the industry has grown up and as we've seen certain people make it in the indie game dev sphere, obviously more money is being pushed into products like that. And now, especially at game shows, Game Awards, sorry, you've seen certain games like Dave the Diver declaring itself an indie game, but the backing and money behind it, for me at least, just makes me think, is this an indie game? And what is an indie game dev now? Because when I go to events and network with people, initially I was calling myself an indie game dev. And especially with how young I was, people were a little taken back and confused. They're like, wow, you're independently making games yourself. You must be like financially stable. How did you come across that money? But back then, being a young YouTube watcher, all I did was watch documentaries on game developers and people doing game jams. And the term that was used for people that weren't working for big companies were indie game devs. And it was hard for me because I felt like that really ignited my imposter syndrome. I did not feel comfortable using the term indie game dev. And so when I eventually heard and came across solo game dev, I definitely connected with it a lot more. And this has come, I think, comment below what you think the origin of this word is, but I think it's come from YouTubers more, and kind of the fact that solo game devs, so people by themselves, are making these full-long games. Where indie games and indie game devs have become this larger thing. I think if you were the hierarchy of size and scale, you got the AAA, you got your AA, you got your indie game devs, which also can kind of match with the AA now, I think, when you have backing and support and audience. And then you have your solo game devs who obviously become quite successful if you've heard about them and know of them. But I think it's also a really good matching term for people who are starting out in the industry by themselves. I'm much happier calling myself now. And when I even said it, I went to GCAP last year saying to people, I'm a solo game dev who's working, full-time somewhere else. They all got it. But previous years, when I'd said I'm an indie game dev, they'd kind of be like, oh yeah, what are you working on? And then it kind of felt like, oh, you're not a real game dev then because your game isn't published or it's half-baked or this isn't what an indie game should be. And so I'm really glad that we've actually come across this term now because I feel like it helps define people but still gives them a valid reason to be making games. 15 years ago, sure, it was a lot harder to make games by yourself, and so I think the title of indie game dev suited because there weren't like a range of people making games. Most people who were making games independently were people who had already been making games for bigger studios and broke off to do their own creative thing. Where now in game dev and in the industry, there are so many people who are probably never going to work for big companies, who make games at home or in a small team online. And yeah, it's interesting because we still need a definition, I think, for people who are working in small teams and aren't necessarily, funded in certain ways. Like we need a term for solo dev that's in a group, which obviously we can just say, well, solo devs working together or whatever. But it's just interesting seeing that the definition of these words change and how it fits and makes things easier. I know in a world where we try to label everything and every meaning, it's funny how we still don't have certain words for certain things. If you study things about language and how different languages say different things, it actually really affects how your mind thinks and works. And especially going to events and trying to network with people and just trying to make friends locally, it's really hard when you have people who are working full-time and are proper game devs in the sense that they get paid to do what they do and they do it a lot better than me. Having words that is a bit more endearing, because I feel like indie game dev, saying that earlier on, kind of came with this prowess of you're going to make a hit game, where solo game dev is, okay, you are working a lot harder in the discipline that is quite difficult. And I think the fact that they include solo kind of shows that you're doing a lot of effort here. Where I think, especially now with all of the cultural things that happen when you first starting making a game, you don't want to make a big MMORPG, full-scale Rome VR, whatever it is going to be, definitely gives off kind of a more prideful indie game dev flair. I'm going to make a hit game that everyone's going to play. It's going to be fantastic. Where solo dev, of course, you can still have that confidence, but I feel a lot more humble saying, yeah, I'm a solo game dev, rather than saying, I'm an indie game dev, because that usually means I come with money and an idea that's going to sell millions. So yeah, I just thought I wanted to share a little thought bubble process about that, because there's not really forums and stuff to talk about these sorts of things. Conventions are more focused on higher level cultural AAA company stuff, and I feel like solo devs in the next 10 years are really going to start having more of a spotlight in these things. We'll see an actual more kind of like a freelance market, but with us making their own games that we want to make. And I hope that by now having this, title that we can use when we're in these networking industry scenarios, people can take us a little bit more seriously. They can give us a bit of slack when we aren't reaching for the stars which so many indie game devs have. Because I think now, like, the indie game dev dream is just that. It's a dream. It's a fantasy that very few people will reach. And a lot of people, I think, are kind of heartbroken, have their dreams shattered when they realize, oh, my game didn't make $1 million. Well, guess what? Online now, you look at people who are making a living, at least, making games, and some of them do make a lot of money with the right marketing and idea behind them. But having this new field of game developers come out and say, okay, we are artists, we are creative thinkers, we are people who make games. We don't work for executives or higher-ups or a boss. Sometimes we're self-funded or we're funded in other ways, but we like to make games and we do it independently. But indie game devs now, I think, have been termed more for people who have made it to the dream. But even then, it's like, I think of games made recently in the past few years made by one person. I would rather call them a solo dev because I feel like it gives them such more credit. You made this game by yourself. Where indie dev now, I feel maybe it's just a term that's been used too much now in my vocabulary growing up, that I'm just kind of like, I don't want to use indie game dev anymore because it's such a, I don't know, gross term. It means so many empty promises, I think, for me at least. That's why I don't like using it. But yeah, that's my ramble about solo and indie game dev. If you want to subscribe for more rambly videos, I'm going to be doing these for a little bit to see how they work. And yeah, if you have any other topics or thoughts or questions about video games, solo game dev, that sort of thing, let me know. I'm going to be doing some rambly things just to see, because out there, right, as I've said this whole video, we have these different groups of people making games. And I feel like the solo game devs and the people who are making games by themselves who don't want to make millions, right? We don't want to be filthy rich. It would be fantastic because we can make games forever then. But there's these groups of people, and especially look at things like Steam and Itch, where there is a industry growing here, and we are still in such a newborn state that the resources and places and things to go aren't all there for us. There are some people who are letting us know, and those who have made it, thankfully, are creating a pathway for us all to kind of understand and learn how to get to where they are. But I feel like in terms of the industry, right, in terms of how publishers work, how conferences work, how people and their hiring practices work, also need to change. Those 3 videos I can probably talk about more in terms of what it's like being a solo game dev, going to game conventions, pitching to publishers as a solo game dev, and getting hired. Because I feel like pitching, we kind of all know that. There's been plenty of people who do pitches to publishers and get their game published as a solo game dev. But getting hired as a solo game dev, it's interesting because I feel like when I say it to recruiters and stuff, they're kind of like, all right, show me a portfolio for your specialized field. Where it's like, I'm a generalist, man. Like I'm the person who will help you make your game and be at the forefront, in the battle trenches, making sure everything can get fixed. Where I'm not highly specialized. I might have certain skills, but as a solo game dev, I think we need to figure out ways on how can we get jobs in the games industry when we're juniors as well. That's a whole other discussion, especially here in Australia. Man, we are suffering. We are suffering in terms of roles being there for juniors, and they're all seniors, and the problem is, it's another topic entirely. So yeah. I'm glad that we have the term solo dev. I feel happier and confident in it. And if you still call yourself an indie game dev, that's fine. We shouldn't keep certain words. In fact, let's take indie game devs back from those big corporations who put it as a tag on Steam, even though they're funded by hundreds of thousands of dollars and have teams of hundreds of thousands of people working on it. Because that, for me, is not indie game dev. True indie game dev is people who are working by themselves or in small groups and are either financially or creatively independent. That's my definition of indie game devs. But of course, because of the cultural shift that we've had, indie game dev means something different now. And corporations, I think, have dirtied the waters and made it a bit gross. So, I'm a solo game dev. I'll use that because it's easier for people to understand me more. And it usually means I feel like that you're just like a broke guy or girl, whoever you are, broke person trying to make a video game. Or you work a full-time job and then work in your game, after hours. It's your 5 to 9 before your 9 to 5. Well, yeah, I don't know. I always wanted to be an indie game dev. Watched all those videos, documentaries of people making games, and I guess I am living the dream somewhat. And I love it. It's just sometimes I wish that I could go back to those golden days of just, being an indie game dev. I'm going to make games by myself and it's going to be awesome. Because, solo game dev feels kind of lonely. It really does. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.